Hello, I'm Karen Stathoplos, and today I'm going to be reading a chapter from another of my favorite books by Daphne du Maurier called Frenchman's Creek. It involves a pirate, I happen to love pirates, but it's a wonderful book. And shortly before this chapter, what has happened is that Donna is married, has 2 children, lives in London in the 1800s. She's married to a very silly man, and she's suddenly realized the futility of her life of foolish, endless round of dinners and parties and stupid pranks. And she summarily took her 2 children and whisked off to Navron in Cornwall, a place that Daphne du Maurier often wrote about, to a summer estate where she has never been. And she finds out from the neighbors that there is a pirate kind of terrorizing, although that's not exactly the word, pillaging their coast, and it's by a Frenchman. One day she wanders on her own estate closer to a creek than she has ever been, and she sees the ship just as she's about to back up because she realizes it must be the pirate Frenchman. Someone slips a coat over her head and captures her. Here we go. Her first feeling was one of anger, of blind, unreasoning anger. How dare anyone treat her thus, she thought. Truss her up like a fowl and carry her to the quay. She was thrown roughly onto the bottom boards of the boat, and the man who had knocked her down took the paddles and pushed out toward the ship. He gave a cry, a seagull's cry, and called something in a patois which she could not understand to his companions on the ship. She heard them laugh in reply, and the lute struck up a merry little jig as though in mockery. She had freed herself by now, and she looked up at the man who had struck her. He spoke to her in French and grinned. He had a merry twinkle in his eye, as though her capture were a game and amusing jest of a summer's afternoon. And when she frowned at him haughtily, determined to be dignified, he pulled a solemn face, feigning fear and pretending to tremble. She wondered what would happen if she raised her voice and shouted for help. Would anyone hear her? Somehow she knew she could not do this. What a fool she had been, she thought, to linger there an instant when she knew that the ship was the Frenchman. How deserving of capture she was, after all, and how infuriating to be placed in such a position. Ridiculous. When a quiet withdrawal to the trees and back to Navron would have been so easy. They were passing now under the stern of the ship, beneath the high poop deck and the scrolled windows, and there was the name, written with a flourish in gold, La Mouette. She wondered what it meant. Her French was hazy suddenly. And now he was pointing to the ladder over the side of the ship, and the men on deck were crowding round, grinning, familiar, to watch her mount. She managed the ladder well, determined to give them no cause for mockery, and shaking her head, she swung herself down to the deck, refusing their offers of assistance. They began to chatter to her in this patois she could not follow. It must be Breton. Had not Godolphin, her neighbor, said something about the ship slipping across to the opposite coast? And they kept smiling and laughing at her in a familiar, idiotic way she found infuriating, for it went ill with the heroic, dignified part she wished to play. She folded her arms and backed away from them, saying nothing. Then the first man appeared again. He had gone to warn their leader, no doubt, the captain of this fantastic vessel, and beckoned her to follow him. It was all different from what she had expected. These men were like children, enchanted with her appearance, smiling and whistling, and she believed pirates to be desperate creatures with rings in their ears and knives in their teeth. The ship was clean. She had imagined a craft filthy and stained and evil-smelling. There was no disorder about it. The paint was fresh, the deck scrubbed, and from the forward part of the ship, where the men lived, she supposed, came the good, hunger-making smell of vegetable soup. And now the man was leading her through a swinging door and down some steps. He knocked on a further door, and a quiet voice bade him enter. Donna stood on the threshold, blinking a little, for the sun was streaming through the windows in the stern, making water patterns in the light wood paneling. Once again, she felt foolish, disconcerted, for the cabin was not the dark hole she had imagined, full of empty bottles and cutlasses, but a room, like a room in a house with chairs and a polished table and little paintings of birds upon the bulkhead. There was something restful about it, restful yet austere, the room of someone who was sufficient to himself. The man who had taken her to the captain withdrew, closing the door quietly, and the figure at the polished table continued with his writing, taking no notice of her. She watched him furtively, aware of sudden shyness and hating herself for it. She, Donna, who was never shy, who cared for nothing and for no one. She wondered how long he would keep her standing there. It was unmannerly. Yet she knew she could not be the first to speak. She thought of Godolphin, her neighbor, suddenly. Godolphin, with his bulbous eyes and the growth on the end of his nose and his fears for his women folk. What would he say if he could see her now, alone in the cabin with the terrible Frenchman? And the Frenchman continued writing, and Donna went on standing by the door. She realized now what made him different from other men. He wore his own hair, as men used to do, instead of the ridiculous curled wigs that had become the fashion. And she saw at once how it suited him, how impossible it would be for him to wear it any other way. How remote he was, how detached, like some student in college studying for an examination. He had not even bothered to raise his head when she came into his presence. And what was he scribbling there anyway that was so important? She ventured to step a little closer so that she could see, and now she realized he was not writing at all. He was drawing. He was sketching with great care a heron standing on the mud flats, as she had seen a heron stand 10 minutes before. Then she was baffled. She was at a loss for words, for thought even, for pirates were not like this. At least not the pirates of her imagination, and why could he not play the part she had assigned to him, become an evil, leering fellow full of strange oaths, dirty, greasy-handed, not this grave figure writing, seated at the polished table, holding her in contempt. Then he spoke at last, but he did not look at her. "It seems you have been spying upon my ship," he said. Immediately she was stung to anger. She? Spying? Good God, what an accusation. "On the contrary," she said, speaking coldly, clearly, in the boyish voice she used to servants. "On the contrary, it seems your men have been trespassing upon my land." He glanced up at once and rose to his feet. He was tall, much taller than she had imagined, and into his dark eyes came a look, surely, of recognition. He smiled slowly, as if in secret. "My very humble apologies," he said. "I had not realized that the lady of the manor had come to visit me in person." He reached forward for a chair, and she sat down without a word. He went on looking at her. That glance of recognition, of secret amusement in his eyes, and he leaned back in his chair, crossing his legs, biting the end of his quill. "Was it by your orders that I was seized and brought here?" she said, "because surely something must be said," and he would do nothing but look her up and down in this singular fashion. "My men are told to bind anyone who ventures to the creek," he says. "As a rule, we have no trouble. You have been more bold than the inhabitants, and alas, have suffered from that boldness. You are not hurt, are you? Bruised?" "No," she said shortly. "What are you complaining about, then?" "I am not used to being treated in such a manner," she said, angry again, because he was making her look like a fool. "No, of course not," he said quietly. "But it will do you no harm." God Almighty, what insolence, what damned impertinence! Her anger only amused him, though, for he went on sitting in his chair and smiling, biting the end of his quill. "What do you propose to do with me?" she said. "Ah, there you have me," he replied, putting down his pen. "I must look up in my book of rules." And he opened a drawer in the table and took out a volume, the pages of which he proceeded to turn slowly with great gravity. Prisoners, method of capture, questioning, detainment, their treatment, etc., etc., he read aloud. Yes, it is all here, but unfortunately these notes relate to the capture and treatment of male prisoners. I have made no arrangements, apparently, to deal with females. It is really most remiss of me. She thought of Godolphin again in his fears, and in spite of her annoyance, she found herself smiling, remembering his words. As the fellow is a Frenchman, it's only a matter of time. His voice broke in upon her thoughts. That is better, he said. Anger does not become you, you know. Now you are beginning to look more like yourself. What do you know of me? She said. He smiled again, tilting forward on his chair. The Lady Saint Colombe, the spoilt darling of the court, the Lady Donna who drinks in London taverns with her husband's friends. You are quite a celebrity, you know. She found herself flushing scarlet, stung by the irony of his words, his quiet contempt. That's over, she said, finished and done with. For the time being, you mean? No, forever. He began whistling softly to himself and, reaching for his drawing, continued to sketch in the background. When you have been at Navron a little while, you will tire of it, he said, and the smells and sounds of London will call to you again. You will remember this mood as a passing thing. No, she said. But he did not answer and went on with his drawing. She watched him, stung with curiosity, for he drew well, and she began to forget she was his prisoner and that they should be at enmity with one another. That heron standing on the mud by the head of the creek, she said. I saw him just now before I came to this ship. Yes, he answered, he is always there when the tide ebbs. It is one of his feeding grounds. He continued his tuneless whistle, drawing the while, and she watched him, thinking how natural it was, how effortless and easy to be sitting here in this cabin on this ship, side by side with the Frenchman, while the sun streamed in through the windows and the ebb tide bubbled around the stern. It was funny, like a dream, like something she had always known would happen, as though this was a scene in a play in which she must act a part, and the curtain had now lifted and someone had whispered, Here, this is where you go on. The night jars have started now in the evenings, he said. They crouch in the hillside farther down the creek. They are so wary, though, that it is almost impossible to get really close. Yes, she said. The creek is my refuge, you know, he said, glancing up at her. I come here to do nothing. And then, just before the idleness gets the better of me, I have the strength of mind to tear myself away to set sail again. And commit acts of piracy against my countrymen, she said. And commit acts of piracy against your countrymen, he echoed. One day they will catch you, she said. One day, perhaps, he said, and he wandered to the window in the stern and looked out. Come and look, he said, and she got up from the table and went and stood beside him. They looked down to the water where there floated a great cluster of gulls, nosing for scraps. They come in the dozens always, he told her. They seem to know at once when we return, and they come in here from the headlands. My men will feed them, I can't prevent them. And I'm as bad myself. I'm always throwing crumbs to them from the windows here. He laughed, and reaching for a crust of bread, he tossed it to them. Perhaps they have a fellow feeling for the ship, he said. It is my fault for naming her La Mouette. La Mouette! The seagull! Of course, I had forgotten what it meant. And they went on watching the gulls leaning against the window. This is absurd, Donna thought. Why am I doing this? This is not what I intended. By now, surely I should be bound with ropes and thrust into the dark hold of the ship, gagged and bruised, and here we are, throwing bread to the seagulls, and I have forgotten to go on being angry. Why are you a pirate? She said at last. Why do you ride horses that are too spirited? He answered. Because of the danger, because of the speed, because I might fall, she said. That is why I am a pirate. Yes, but there are no buts. It is all very simple, really. There are no dark problems about it. I have no grudge against society, no bitter hatred of my fellow men. It just happens that the problems of piracy interest me, and they suit my particular bent of thought. It is not just a matter of brutality and bloodshed, you know. The organization takes many hours of many days. Every detail of a landing has to be thought out and prepared. I hate disorder and any slipshod method of attack. The whole thing is very much like a geometrical problem. It is food for the brain. And then, I have my fun, my spice of excitement, my beating of the other fellow. It is very satisfying, very absorbing. Yes, she said, I understand. You are puzzled, aren't you? He said, laughing down at her. Because you expected to find me drunk here on the floor, surrounded by blood and knives and bottles and shrieking women. She smiled back at him but did not answer. Someone knocked at the door, and when the Frenchman called, "Enter," one of his men came in bearing a great bowl of soup upon a tray. Oh, it smelt rich and good. The hot steam rose in the air. The man proceeded to lay the table, spreading a white cloth on the further end. He went to a locker in the bulkhead and brought out a bottle of wine. Donna watched. The smell of the soup was very tempting, and she was hungry. The wine looked cool in the slim bottle. "Will you have some?" he said. She nodded, feeling foolish again. Why did he read her thoughts? And he fetched another plate and spoon and another glass from the cupboard. Then he pulled up 2 chairs to the table. She saw that there was new bread, too, freshly baked in the French fashion, the crust dark and brown, and little pats of very yellow butter. They ate their meal in silence, and then he poured out the wine. It was cold and clear, not too sweet. And all the while she kept thinking how like a dream this was, like a remembered dream that she had had once, a quiet, familiar thing, a dream she recognized. I have done this before, she thought. This is not the first time. Yet that was absurd, for of course it was the first time, and he was a stranger to her. She wondered what hour it was. The children would have returned from their picnic. Prue would be putting them to bed. They would run and knock upon her door, and she would not answer. It does not matter, she thought. I don't care. And she went on drinking her wine, looking at the bird pictures on the bulkhead, and now and again stealing a glance at him when she knew his head was turned away. Then he reached out an arm toward a tobacco jar on a shelf and began to shake the mixture into his hand. It was close cut, very dark and brown. And suddenly, the truth striking at her like a blow, she saw the tobacco jar in her bedroom, the volume of French poetry, with the drawing of a seagull on the title page. She saw William running to the belt of trees. William, his master, who made voyages from place to place when whose life was one continual escape. She got up from her chair, staring at him. "Good God," she said. He looked up. "What is the matter?" "It's you," she said. "You who left the tobacco jar in my bedroom and the volume of Ronsard. It's you who have been sleeping in my bed." He smiled, amused at her choice of words, smiling too at her astonishment, her confusion and dismay. "Did I leave them there?" he said. "I had forgotten. How very remiss and careless of William not to have noticed." "It was for you William stayed at Navron," she said. "It was for your sake he let the servants send them away. All these months while we were in London, you have been at Navron." "No," he said. "Not continually. From time to time, when it suited my plans. And in the winter, you know, it can be damp here in the creek. It made a change, a luxurious change, to seek the comfort of your bedroom. Somehow, I always felt that you would not mind." He went on looking at her with that glimmer of secret amusement in his eyes. "I consulted your portrait, you know," he said. "I addressed myself to it several times. 'My lady,' I said, for I was very subservient, 'would you grant a very weary Frenchman the courtesy of your bed?' and it seemed to me that you bowed gracefully and gave me permission. Sometimes you even smiled. It was very wrong of you, she said, very irregular. I know, he said. Besides being dangerous, that was the fun of it. And if I had known for one moment, what would you have done? I should have come down to Navron at once. And then I should have barred the house. I should have dismissed William, and I should have set a watch on the estate. All that. Yes. I don't believe you. Why not? Because when I lay in your bed looking up at your portrait, that was not how you behaved. How did I behave? You joined my ship's company, for one thing. You signed your name amongst the faithful. You were the first and the last woman to do so. And saying this, he rose from the table and went to a drawer, fetched out a book. This he opened, and on the page she saw the words La Muette, followed by a string of names, Edmond Vaquier, Jules Thomas, Pierre Blanc, and so on. He reached for his pen, dipped it in ink, and handed it to her. Well, he said, what about it? She took it from him, balancing it in her hand a moment as though weighing the question, and she did not know whether it was the thought of Harry, her husband, in London, yawning over his cards, or Godolphin with his bulbous eyes, or the good soup she had taken and the wine she had drunk, making her a little drowsy and warm and a little careless, or whether it was because he was standing there beside her, but she looked up at him, laughing suddenly, and signed her name in the center of the page beneath the others, Donna Saint Colombe. And now you must go back. Your children will wonder what has happened to you, he said. Yes, she said. First, you must be introduced. And he called out an order in the Breton patois she could not understand. And in a moment, his company assembled themselves, glancing up at her in curiosity. I am going to tell them that from henceforth you come to the creek unchallenged, he said. You are free to come and go as you please. The creek is yours. The ship is yours. You are one of us. He spoke to them briefly, and one by one they came up to her and bowed and kissed her hand, and she laughed back at them, saying, Thank you. There was a little madness about, a frivolity like a dream under the sun. Below in the water, one of the men waited for her in the boat. And Navron House, he said, is it barred and bolted? Is William to be dismissed? No, she said. I must return your call then as a matter of courtesy. Of course. What is the correct hour? In the afternoon, I believe, between 3 and 4, you'll give me a dish of tea? She looked at him laughing and shook her head. No, she said, that is for Lord Godolphin and the gentry. Pirates do not call upon ladies in the afternoon. They come stealthily, by night, knocking upon a window, and the lady of the manor, fearful for her safety, gives him supper by candlelight. As you will, he said. Tomorrow then, at 10 o'clock? Yes, she said. Good night. Good night, she said.